Hi, this is Brian Aganad, founder of the Asana Academy and the Asana Academy podcast. I get a lot of questions about press handstand. So what I want to cover today very quickly is just three quick tips. To call these things quick tips to help you with your press handstand, what you've been going that could be going wrong. So I get a lot of emails and I get a lot of questions from students working on doing their press handstand. And very common thing is they're always stuck, but they're stuck for reasons they don't know why. And I find that students oftentimes focus on the wrong things. And because when you look at a press handstand from the outside, you see it as this strength-based movement. You see it as something that requires a lot of strength. So the most common misconception I get from students is, well, I'm just not strong enough to do it. That's not always the case. That really isn't always the case. So I want to give you three quick tips to consider if you're working on your press handstand. So tip number one is start by looking at your weight shifting. Look at how you shift your weight. Now, this is a really common thing is when you're practicing a press handstand, shifting forward becomes almost like an obsession because it's a weight transfer from your feet to your hands, a weight transfer from your feet to your hands. And so what happens is students get overly focused on going so far forward. Now, I want to make a recommendation for you to consider. Think about your shoulders for a second. So yes, in order for you to go anywhere, your shoulders do have to come over the wrists, but they don't have to go too far. So if you shift your shoulders too far forward, but don't actually focus on the hips, you're not going to go up, you're just going to go forward, and that's what sets you up to fall. So a press handstand isn't just about going forward. It's about going forward, going up. So think about that. Think not just about shifting the shoulders forward, but lifting the hips up as much as possible. So I like to call this the mini shift in a press handstand. And this is something you should think about. Rather than focusing immediately on just shifting the weight from the feet into the hands, focus on doing what I call this mini shift. And that's shifting, the first shift is shifting the weight from the heel of your foot into the toes of your feet. So you shift the weight from the heels of feet to the toes in your feet. That's what I call a mini shift. What that does is that's what creates subconsciously the lift in the hips. So there's an upward lifting action in the hips and then a forward action. And if you do the mini rock, so a press handstand consists of two weight shifts. One, shifting from the heels to the toes, then from the toe tips into the hands. So that's how you can break down a press handstand into two pieces. Now, tip number two with your press handstand, if you feel stuck, is consider your flexibility. Consider how mobile you are in the hamstrings. This is the principle that I talk about all the time with my students, and it's called active versus passive flexibility. So if you're not familiar with what that is, let me tell you. Let's use the splits as an example. When you're working on the splits, you feel your hamstring stretching. You feel it right down there in the center of your hamstring, right in the center belly of the hamstring, right? So think about it like this. Think about flexibility this way. This is really what I call passive flexibility, in that you have to physically move your body into a shape to feel the stretch. You physically have to move your body into the splits to feel the hamstring stretching. Versus now active flexibility, here's the thing. Imagine that feeling you took in the splits when you did the splits. Imagine taking that feeling, replicating it while standing up. So imagine being able to actively stretch your hamstrings without physically moving the body into the splits. And I know that's got to be a complicated topic to consider or something to wrap your head around. But really think about it. Think about being able to use your muscles. Think about being able to use your muscles without physically having to move them. Learn to engage them. Because in a press handstand, I'm talking about a straight leg press handstand here, is a big factor in being able to stack the hips over the shoulders comes from how long you can make your hamstrings. Because if your hamstrings aren't long enough, you're not going to be able to get the hips over the shoulders no matter how far forward you go. Your shoulders will just go forward. So consider that another one of the components, being able to extend, being able to lengthen your hamstrings in the exact same way you do in the splits in a press handstand. That's what I teach my students. There's a feeling that you can replicate in your hamstrings to help lift yourself up. So that's tip number 2. Now, tip number three is kind of it's a common one that it's another really common thing that students tend to over focus on. Again, it's based on the strength thing, is that there's this natural mechanism to clinch the shoulders and the traps the moment before you press. It's almost as if this fight or flight mechanism kicks in. And this is especially true if you're a guy. If you're a big, strong guy, you naturally think that you can muscle everything with the shoulders. You naturally think you can muscle everything with the shoulders and the traps. That's actually not true. You want to focus, again, on proper core engagement. I talk about this a lot. I have plenty of articles on my blog that you can read about this to engage the core correctly in different handstand tips. But learning to engage the core correctly and not overemphasize the shoulders and the traps goes a long way. Now, when you have all these tips tie into one another, and that with the hamstrings, you don't need nearly as much core strength as you think, as long as you have the hamstring flexibility to pull the hips over the shoulders, but you do need enough to get yourself up there. So getting your core to engage correctly is so key. Now, there's lots of other tactical ways you can physically work on the motion of the press. I have an article on my blog called The Press Handstand Strategy That Works. You can read it. I have a lot of physical tactics you can do, but I'm trying to get you to think about the inner workings of the pose. I'm really trying to get you to think about the details, the fine details of the pose. In a press, for example, in your press handstand, when the moment you're about to lift the feet off the ground, pay really close attention to this. Pay close attention to what happens in your shoulders and what happens in your traps. Because oftentimes when you feel stuck, you'll tend to clinch. Versus in reality, if you go back to that feeling of lifting the hips up and then forward from that micro shift in the heels to the toes, your shoulders and traps are going to naturally stay relaxed. And that's what you're going for. That's going to help your core to engage correctly. In addition, I recommend, so if you have a hard time engaging your core, or not just that, if you have a hard time relaxing your shoulders and your traps, take a block, put it between your legs, then try and go forward. That's really going to help. That's really going to help to get your core muscles to engage. That's going to encourage your pelvic floor to engage. That's going to encourage from there TVA to engage. And you're going to have a much more pure core engagement when you lift. Super important. The moment the toes are about to lift up off the ground, getting that engagement exactly correct is so key. So those are just 3 of my quick tips for pressing up to handstand today. I got a ton more of these coming. Now, if you're not subscribed to my newsletter, I send out sequences, videos, tips, a whole bunch of interesting things. Go to www.theasanaacademy.com/signup, and you can get on my newsletter, and I send a ton of interesting things to you. 2, you can also find my podcast at www.theasanaacademy.com/podcasts with an S. So that's www.theasanaacademy.com/podcasts with an S. Thank you for watching today. If you have any comments or you have any questions, leave them below. Leave them in the box below, and I'll get back and answer them. Have a good day. Talk to you guys later.